talking about the 17 United Nations goals. And so my first question is, what do those goals mean to you at a personal level, at a professional level? Which do you prioritize? Which do you, focus most on?
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, those United Nations goals, it's weird because I'm revisiting it after so many years. Like in 1997, those goals were sort of brought into my attention in this thing, Emerging Paradigms in Design Education. Actually, it was a conference about sustainability, collaboration, and community, organised. And I was a contributor. It was put together by the University of New South Wales. And a lot of the sort of same issues that were kind of brought out at that time and at that conference are kind of coming back into sort of view, but it's like they went out of view for a little while. And for me now, it's always been a backdrop inside with my work anyway, with the environmental stuff, things to do with sustainability. And now I'm actually just setting up a group of people who are to work on a project which is to do with creating a kind of design manifesto where we're kind of coming up with ideas as creatives but connecting together. Mm-hmm. So by sharing ideas, almost like what do sort of spiritually, which is obviously a very important part of my life, creating the same sort of format, but for each person to say what it is that they want to do as well, in terms of how they want to step into responsibility. So one was to do with saying what it was that they wanted to do personally to in terms of a design, what issue they would like to bring into the fore. And then the other one is to do with what they already appreciate that already exists. So it's like bringing that kind of spiritual way of looking at environmental issues.
Well, when we talk about artists, we talk about creatives, there are those who are highly creative and they manage to make a good professional kind of impact with their creativity. And then there's that concept of the starving artist. And I'm looking at the first goal of like no poverty. And that no poverty, it's kind of misleading because sometimes we can be very highly creative and choose to be poor compared with like working in an environment where financially we might be a lot richer. But so poverty can be, it depends on the context. It's like if we are choosing to spend all our time and energy on our passion, regardless of whether it makes us financial kind of return, is that really poverty? That concept of the starving artist, it's like, do we need to be making material kind of gains at the expense of like, maybe not prioritizing our creativity as much and at the cost of our well-being? Because I'm sure and I know a lot of highly creative people who in terms of their well-being, the well-being is kind of compromised, I suppose, because they have to struggle to pay the rent and the bills and whatever, but they're being highly creative. And so there's always kind of like it's a paradox, isn't it? It's like, do we go for like high level of well-being and engaging in things as though they were our hobbies, or do we kind of like let go of our hobbies and kind of go into that world of like, say, spend decades making money thinking, well, later on when I retire, then I'll go back to those things that I'm really passionate about?
Probably, I mean, it's interesting what you say, but I think maybe both of those things can be true. It's like that we can make space for both, for the work that we need to do, but also still make space for the things that we really like to do, keep the passion I mean, there's a really amazing kind of concept which is called igaki, is a Japanese concept, and you can actually, it's they make a ratio, I don't know if you've heard of it, of like, yes, you can use a portion of your life for the things that you need to do, and then a portion of your life for what you're passionate about, and a portion of your life for your kind of health and well-being. So it's like you actually break your life down into components, and it's okay to have both. It's like, maybe if we swing too far one way or the other, is out of balance. So it's like, if I only work and I'm completely miserable, that is an imbalance. If I'm, you know, working on things, they're not making any money, and I'm literally starving or really in poverty, then that's also out of balance. So probably there is something between the two that can bring it into balance. Yes, we can spend some time doing these things and other times doing others. And it's about, to me, the most important question that you can ask yourself every day is, what is value to me? What is the value of life? In fact, whenever I think of a question, so like say that first question about poverty, it's also like, what actually is poverty? How do we define what poverty is? I mean, we can have a poverty mindset. What is a poverty mindset? A poverty mindset may always trap us into ways of being that, even if we have, and I actually know people that are, you know, millionaires, but they still have a poverty mindset.
Yes, because
and I know people who are very poor,
yeah,
who have so many friends and so many wonderful things around, but yet and they have an abundant mindset. But maybe
yeah. So somebody who's a
what is
millionaire,
that?
somebody who's very, you know, appears to be very lucrative, they may be living in a house which is beyond their means. They have a very high mortgage on it, and so they're doing work that they hate. You know, they might not be very passionate about their work, but they feel compelled to engage in that work because they need to do that in order to be able to afford to live in, you know, with that high mortgage. And so in a way that is also a poverty, because that person is not able to choose the work they want to do. They you know, so it comes at a cost. Living in a big house, driving a big car, you know, like living beyond our means does come up. There is a price to pay for that as well, isn't there?
There is. And I mean, also the other thing, there's like a bigger sort of aspect of sort of the way we've lived our lives over this period of time as human beings. Not everybody's living their lives in a way of material abundance, but in the West we can say that we've had material abundance. Has that actually brought happiness? Is a good question. And you know, again, like when I look at people like, I've traveled a lot. I mean, one of the main things that in my life that I was interested to do was to travel, and I was always interested in people. In education, I was always interested in learning. And in fact, there's a guy called David Suzuki who we actually did it. I joined them on the trail, and his daughter was one of the people who spoke at the big human rights conference. That was in 1990, just before 1996. So when was that? 1995, I think it was. And she made a very moving speech about the environment at that time. And you know, people were catalyzed into movement and momentum for a period of time. And you know, again, it was like countries that had all this affluence that were sort of saying, how do we are the ones that have created all this material culture, and we are the ones that want to take responsibility for it now. but at the same time, they were emerging, sort of kind of cultures who were kind of moving into new in their own industrial age in a very different time, something, coming through like in this digital time. So at the same time, there was sort of manufacturing, things like that still happening in China in ways that are maybe not clean, but also in Thailand, in Indonesia. I've been some of these places where I saw both the indigenous people and how they were living. Not many of the dying sort of indigenous populations, but sort of where the cultures were dying off, and the people's moving more into this sort of modern, what we call Western material culture. And it didn't necessarily bring happiness, and it's not necessarily bring us happiness. So, but there is something about a certain level of quality of life, of health, of well-being, of support that is very important. In fact, some of the indigenous cultures actually have a lot of those things. I went on a trail, and we went to lots of different indigenous cultures. I've done this in various different places. And in Thailand, we noticed really how people were very supportive to each other within their own, within that culture, where within their own tribes, people were supportive of each other, even neighbour to neighbour, like even within tribe to tribes. They had their differences, but humans, when they're living in that sort of way, which we might say, well, materially their quality of life may be quite low, but at the same time, they actually happiness factor, their support factor, the life perception of quality of life is much higher.
Well, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of research to show that people who live very long lives, one of the common denominators between these people who become octogenarians and live over 100 years old, for example, one of the common factors is their relationships, the strength of their relationships. It's not to do with how much material wealth they've accumulated. It's to do with the quality of their human relationships and that happiness factor, I suppose.
That's true. I mean, and cultures where the extended family is very integrated, like the Italians, some of my really closest friends now that I've been living in London are showing me all these different sort of examples as well, and you can really see such difference. Like the Italians, they do have the extended family and supporting generation after generation, and it's not uncommon to have many generations sitting around the table, maybe not every day, but a few times a year, and they know where they are within the within that kind of network in a way. So they know that they've got this kind of support. Again, Spanish and Latin cultures often have these sort of, and each different culture we all have these different sort of nuances. And I know there was some research that some of the longest living people, like the Japanese and the Italian, I think Italians were some of the longest living peoples. And it was to do with their support, to do with network. It also was to do with diet as well, but it wasn't to do with complicated diet. It was actually to do with having simplicity in the diet, healthy diet in a sense of, probably local, maybe sustainable, sort of not foods that are kind of come from all around the world. I mean, it's so a lot of things that we've been kind of moving towards within Western culture, which is, you know, been this sort of idea of choice, so much choice that it's really difficult to know what to get. And, you know, I think people, you know, like my friends, you know, that they could go to any supermarket, they're actually choosing to go to Lidl and Aldi, where there's actually less choice because it's less stressful. You know, you can just choose very fresh things. It makes you choose differently as well. So yeah,
I suppose it's this, you know, we've lost trace of where our food comes from. And when you talk about, I think it's the Sardinians, they have octogen, a lot of, it's called a blue spot. You know, they have octogenarians in a greater proportion of octogenarians in Sardinia, in Japan, and it's local food that is the main diet, whereas most of us who live in cities, we don't know where our food comes from, and we will, you know, we go for the exotic. We go, you know, it's not even tomatoes, for example. I buy tomatoes in the local supermarkets. My tomatoes don't come locally, even though they can be grown locally, but they come from Spain, they come from Italy, they come from all over the world. And so, you know, that is the price that we pay for that choice, and the price we pay for, you know, being able to afford to eat exotic food. It's having an impact on the climate. And so when we talk about no poverty, again, it's contextualized, isn't it? It's like, if we are able to afford to buy any food that we like avocados and figs and dates and food from, like, we don't even know where it grows, but we can afford to buy it, there is a cost to that which is unseen, and the cost to that is to the climate, to the ecological things, and we don't even think about it. No one has that cost to the environment in their balance sheets. It's a hidden cost, it's an invisible cost, isn't it?
Exactly, I do agree. I mean, it's like I think if you live in the cities, you're more pulled into that. I mean, I actually just moved to Essex. My new studio is here in Essex, a little bit further out. I mean, was in London, or I had my studio anyway in London for decades. And actually what I found is within this place where I'm living now, that people are actually showing me a much more sustainable way of living, from having you know, gardens where they're growing their own vegetables, to there's the allotments which can, you know, anyone can go to them. They're walking distance from here. You know, for me as a city girl, I actually during the lockdown tried for the first time to grow my own tomatoes. I'd rather be doing a very big design project than growing my own tomatoes. It's literally very alien to me. And my next door neighbour was fascinated by my complete uselessness. They were like, wow, she doesn't know. And then I was like, and actually I really, after not impressing him at all, he was like, you know, probably, you know, courgettes and marrows are pretty well something you only have to really grow them. You just put them in the ground and they just grow by themselves. Because tomatoes, you have to like nip the seeds off and stuff, and repot some of them, like doing them from seed. But the marrows was like much easier. You could just put them really pretty much straight in the ground. So in the end, everyone was like really interested in my uselessness as a gardener. And but I really wanted to know, you know, how to do these very simple things. And I did learn. And it really is a big learning curve for me, because I literally, city girl, uni, design, growing stuff, it's like such a down-to-earth thing that maybe we all should know how to do, at least some things. And again, in this place where I live, we're actually going to make one of the little communal spaces into an area we grow herbs. So, and actually in some of the little gardens here, we have this things like near the market, there's some different things that are growing. You could just pick your own basil, or, you know, little things, but actually it's like, it starts to build a feeling of that, where you can actually get local things, and people also swapping, buying, growing their own thing. So even if I only ever managed to learn to grow courgettes, I can swap
Yeah.
maybe with other people, because that there's also an app that I use where you can, I mean, a few times I've had a kind of glut of different things, or pick lots of pears. There's it's amazing pear trees and stuff just right in the little town here, but not everyone's sort of picking them. And I always used to like making compote. That's my only thing that I did that's like very connected to, well, even when I lived in the city, because I had a big pear tree in the flats where we lived,
Mm-hmm.
and I used to see them getting wasted, and I just thought, oh, that's such a shame. So in the end, there's a few of us that got into like picking them every year, and started to make them into compote, into pies, crumble, and would freeze it. So felt really good using these pears. And also, again, like if you only have a pear tree, you can actually make all these things. You can actually have so much different food. We can learn to cook differently. I mean, I used to also put them in jars and give them to people for presents. And the people that was in the block used to give them, some of it as well. None of them died. Some people thought, oh, that's so nice, and brought me like things that they made. Like one of my girlfriends was fantastic at making a chili sauce. It's from Guyana. And different people would be like, oh, actually that's very sweet. Whether they actually liked it or not, no. Pass it on to someone else or whatever. But there was a sense of, this exchange, and people kind of, oh, that's so sweet, nice idea, and kind of saying, oh, I actually do this, or I make that. And so that was actually quite a nice way of, even when I lived in London, creating that environment of exchange and being resourceful with what is. And maybe we're going to face more and more of these kind of things. And initially, it may be a bit of a shock for me, like people like me, that I literally didn't know how to cook how to not cook anything, how to grow. I'm a really good cook, but as a gardener, rocket, I think weeds I can grow with.
Yeah, well, this is the whole concept of communities, isn't it? It's like in a community, not everyone is expected to have the same skills, because that wouldn't work as a community. And you talk about allotments, and I think that's a good example of how creativity is born very often through necessity, because the allotments concept was created like during the World War I, where food was in short supply, and these allotments were created so that people could grow their own food and share with each other, and that kind of creates sustainable communities. And with sustainable cities, it's like, well, London, Birmingham, I know like there are pockets of communities in all of these big cities, but as a whole, most people tend to live very isolated lives in a city, because they go to work, which is often very far away from where they live, and where they live, they don't know very many people, because they're spending most of their life at work. So there's that kind of breakdown, there's that undermining of strong relationships. So I know a lot of people through the pandemic who felt lost because their social life was all wrapped up at work, and so therefore when they couldn't go out to work and they had to work from home, they saw their own loneliness, because there wasn't anybody around at home.
No.
Had friends at work, so that, before COVID and after COVID, this concept of sustainable cities, in terms of sustainable in relationships as well, it's really changed, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, I think that was a paradigm shift for us as humans. Like, being with ourselves to start with, you know, a lot more. Even if you're in a family, you know, you could be in isolation. You didn't know whether, you know, you were potentially infecting someone else if you'd got exposed. There were so many different things that were going on that would make people, I mean, create more fear within each individual, but at the same time, it took each person into themselves. When you can't go outside, you have to go inside. And so people did turn inwards. And I think it was like hard. And it was, you know, we saw the more breakdowns in marriages than any other time. You know, it was a huge amount of divorces, people actually having to live with the person who they married. I mean, and I think, you know, lots of things like domestic abuse was like came into the fore. So many different things that probably our community, you know, the communities that we lived in had been able to sort of being pushed under the rug when faced with our own situations amplified. We actually have to start being really honest with ourselves. But actually, that was a paradigm shift in terms of us, a responsibility, us being more responsible for ourselves in terms of whether potentially we could infect somebody else, or responsibility in terms of, you know, whether we drive to work and start to, because obviously we have all these different changes that we were wanting, that the also government were talking about making, the world talking about making, in terms of becoming more sustainable as well. And strangely, then the lockdown actually allowed, you know, the nature to recover. We were seeing in cities, you know, nature was reclaiming it and coming back into some of the cities. I saw that myself, and you know, that was really quite a joy. You know, I actually saw, I was in East London and I saw deer, and I was like, wow. So yeah, I mean, nature is when humans take responsibility, it's maybe our ability to respond to what is within, to be responsible. What does that actually mean? You know, my ability to respond to what's happening each day, to be able to respond to my own inner world and to face what's coming up, whether it's to do with being more responsible for the environment, whether it's dealing with my own isolation. In the end, we're the only ones. We can call our friends, we can talk to them and burn their ears, talking about how miserable we are. We may not keep them as friends for very long. So in fact, our ability to respond to ourselves, to face whatever it is that we need to face, including things like isolation, to do with how I as a human live. And a lot of people during that time, and friends that I know, artists and designers, and I mean, a lot of different sorts of people in different professions that I know had made these decisions not to live in the same places anymore. They wanted to live somewhere where they can actually go for a walk, where they are living in the place that they actually want to be. And some people just like still really happy they were in London, and London is fantastic, you know, but they're like, where you are in London made a difference as well. You know, you're near a park, that would increase the quality of life. You know, those friends, well, they could just come straight out from their house and go into a park. That's really nice. But if you like live somewhere that's very urban, I mean, you could actually feel very, very trapped. If you had a garden, you know, when the weather was nice, that was really amazing because people benefited from that. As an art, I benefited from speaking to my neighbours who instructed me on how to, very badly, you know, as I say, grow different things. And I was looking over my neighbour's garden, and they were spending so much time then. His garden is beautiful, really immaculate. And at the back, he had, you know, tomatoes, courgettes, and all different greens, peas.
Well,
Fantastic,
when
amazing garden.
when you describe a house and a garden like that, and in contrast, we had families in tower blocks with,
Yeah,
you know, like in say a 2-bedroom place with 3 children, and so that's a very that's a contrast to what you're describing, and
yeah,
in the context of equalities, we know that we're all different, we have different skills, we make different choices. Some people prefer to live next to a park, some people prefer to live next to their family, you know, and we due to our preferences and choices and our skills and our experiences, we will live very different lives. So how do we navigate this whole concept of equalities, knowing that we are so different in terms of what we want in life? You know, we may choose to focus our lives on being creative, even though no one values our creativity, but we value it, you know. And so how do we say that a person who chooses to spend their life in creative pursuits that are only valuable to themselves, compared to another person who wakes up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do something productive that is valuable to the community, you know, should they be earning the same amount? Because otherwise, like in terms of material wealth, they're not going to be equal. How do we navigate these inequalities and the diversity in terms of who we are as human beings?
but there's a space for whatever is. If somebody wants to live in a really urban setting, you know, and at one time I was that person. I mean, I lived in really urban places, lived in Hong Kong, tower blocks, in, you know, places like where there was a lot of density. I lived in Sharton, which was like tower blocks. It was near the university, 10th floor. I mean, I lived, that wasn't even low, that wasn't that high. Most people were living in, you know, really high stories. So, but, you know, people made use of things like balconies, and it can be a choice. It is a choice, and it's a different way of living. Tower blocks don't necessarily mean horrible. I mean, again, you know, whether people grow things on the roof or have communal gardens, I think a lot more people, every person maybe will need to have access to places where maybe things become more local, where there is more exchange. Maybe exchange, some people may not want to exchange products. Maybe we can actually sometimes exchange services for some products. I mean, of people that I, you know, in my life that I know in who live in cities, and as I said, most of my life I lived in a city. It's only really now in the last couple of years that I've sort of really moved out, and it's a very big change. And I actually didn't think that I would make that decision, but you know, that's it. Everyone's going to make whatever decision. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and that for me was to be closer. You know, got elder parents, and it's kind of being closer at this time. So you know, you don't know what decisions you're going to make, but everybody, I think, should be able to choose what's right for them. At the same time, there should be a certain quality of life that no one should really be struggling to live. Things like food banks in a country like England, where we have such high level of affluence, that repulses me, that sort of thing really exists.
Well,
So,
the thing about these food banks, though, is that when I see on TV all these food banks, the food that they're giving doesn't seem to be very healthy food. It's canned,
no.
it's canned food. And I just think, well, why don't they have kind of food which is like whole food, like fruits and
Yeah.
vegetables, and teach people how to cook rather than opening up cans of beans.
Yeah, because people are going to get malnourished. So and I think it's like, how do we, at the moment we are changing as a society, there are ways of growing food, clean food. Again, when I was in London, it was really interesting. There was I went to it was a tower block actually, but again, it was right in the centre of London. And what they were growing inside the tower block food, on the inside and the outside. And what's it called? I think it's called biodynamic food. And basically, it looks quite aesthetic as well. So it can be integrated into how we live, that kind of, but at the same time, it's like so many changes. So in some ways, each community needs to be able to make their decisions, and each community is going to be so different, the kind of decisions that they make. But one of the things that maybe in some of the basic human rights are like, clean water, clean air. And if we are not actually getting that, if people are not getting that, if they're choosing to live in the city, and are people really choosing to be in a place which is got a low quality of life, or is it that they become sort of trapped in that situation? Again, in China, where people wanted to have their industrial revolution, they wanted to have their time, and that was their right to do that. And then but actually, what happened there is that the high level of pollution, one of the ladies that I used to work with as a designer, she actually went to live in China for a while. She lived in Taiwan predominantly, but she was going backwards and forwards to China, and the air quality in Shanghai, so bad. They actually had videos of the sunrise. It's like really dystopian. It was like really, really sad.
The thing is, you see, that we've outsourced all our manufacturing to places like China. So China is there with all that pollution, creating stuff that the West are buying
in pound shops.
Yeah, in pound shops. That's right. So basically, China is providing us with cheaper versions of that manufacturing which previously was done here. So we haven't actually made our manufacturing any cleaner. We've just pushed it away to where we can't see it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and polluting somewhere else. So the only thing is, I mean, because I worked as a designer, and actually with some of the designers that I did work with before in Conran, I've been talking to them. So we've been talking about trying to make a sort of network, an environmental network, where we actually come up with sort of solutions and stuff, more like questions, really. And questions will always lead to some kind of solutions, because it's only when we ask questions that we can start to even think that there might be a solution. And solutions may not always be exactly what we want, but it might be that it's that by asking questions, I can't answer that question, but somebody else can, or somebody else can, or a few people together come together and come up with a solution that none of us could have ever thought of. But
sometimes the question is the first step in challenging the status quo. Or, the question is like a desire to see something differently, a desire to understand something that we don't already understand. And so it's in formulating that question we stretch our horizons in terms of making that invisible visible and the unseen seen.
That's so true. And I think that's you know, the lessons that we are facing now as humans are really, it is all to do with being responsible. It's to do with an ability to respond to your own life, the ability to respond to the world as a global. We are a global. We've just had, global economy. We are a globe. We had things that the pandemic, which brought people together in terms of a crisis that brought us together. We had the same crisis all around the world. People had very different views about it, and yet everyone was still speaking about it. And I guess in that way, it brought people together. It did kind of create some solid understanding of a problem. And then people did start to come up with, different sorts of solutions. It's not that there is going to be a solution to that per se, but it actually got people asking questions in the end, not just about, COVID, so that isolation, people actually turning, when they couldn't go out, they had to turn inwards. And that brought different kind of fruit to our consciousness, collectively, individually, community-wise. Nothing was the same. I mean, I ended up staying where my parents lived for a period of time during during the lockdown, and was part of a few different creative projects where a few different businesses decided to get together and try to do some sort of different things in the local community. But also there was, that might not have happened normally. I would not have had those conversations. And it was like lots of different people, like charities and businesses and all sorts of different people kind of coming together. There was also a feeling on the street, the street where I live, where they live, and I was visiting, that there was a sense of, people actually extending their energy to each other much more.
Yeah, because we are social beings, aren't we? As human beings, we are social animals. We're not meant to be living on our own in isolation. It's the relationships that make
absolutely
around. Yeah.
And it was hard to see, so you could really see that those that were suffering from isolation, and I mean, staying at my parents for that period of time, the beach was at the top of the road. So that gave me a sense of freedom in the period of time when I was staying there. I ended up it was, and ended up really, I mean, we were going for those nights, I went for those walks. It was like, for me, it ended up being kind of almost life-changing to spend that much time in nature. I mean, I was getting up, doing meditation, going to the beach, or even, when it was really nice, doing meditation on the beach, or I do qigong as well. So I was going out, and each person that I saw, there was a real sense of, although people weren't going up and being physically contacting each other, there was just a different thing, like eye contact, and people genuinely seem to be asking, instead of where people just like, oh, hi, how are you? But just saying it like in a way that's like a social cue. They actually were looking like, hey, how are you? They really looked like they cared. And there was a real change in that sort of, in the energy. And that's where I think, so I mean, our ability to respond to each other as amplified as we are being more responsible to ourselves. And that's the thing that really came to light for myself. And I realized how much, when I was hearing some of the different things that was happening within the community, where around where they lived and the things that were happening to people, whether it was like they'd just been pushed so far into the extreme. So some families were really being pushed into poverty because basically where they live is really close to one of the most, they say, one of the most disadvantaged areas. And yet I have worked there, and really the people, again, it's got like an amazing community, real solidarity. It's Jaywick, but actually and there was a awful program on TV, you know, slagging off that area and stuff, but they don't live in that area. My parents live near to it. They live in just a little bit further around the coast, Essex coast. And you know, there's so much difference from community to community, but we're right next to this area where it's very disadvantaged in terms of money, you know, but was had a high proportion of people that are considered on the margins. But if you go to the community centre, but it's really nice and fantastic, and you know, there's a lot of support, everybody's supporting each other, so you get more of that kind of energy than in some of the areas where maybe people have more material affluence, but then there is sort of a little more sort of like the island of sort of defending their toilet paper and you know, isolated lives. Like you could get a lot more of that sort of separation. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's like I could really see, you could really see that, you know, again, go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, what is poverty? I mean, and that's supposed to be one of the poorest areas in the country, Jaywick. But you go there, beautiful beach, really lovely, like community. It's difficult, there are challenges, but they are just different challenges. So it doesn't have high level of money, but it has high level of other things that maybe make quality of life better. Whereas in, you know, slightly more affluent areas, maybe, you know, there was more isolation, less support, because people were actually more in their houses, but maybe then it's like, you know, families more sticking together. However, during the lockdown, not everybody's families live closer, and I think then that's also made people decide, okay, maybe now actually is the time I'm going to move closer to granny or the people that you care about. So it's like you know, there was a lot of lessons that came, and I think in the end for myself there was a massive learning curve, because I didn't really know what was happening to other people before the lockdown. It's down the road, and then I did know. And some of it was like actually moved me to, you know, want to volunteer for things or to do. It changed me. I mean, on Christmas Eve I was handing out lunches that we delivered food to some of the families who were homeless in the area, and I'd never done anything like that before when I was in London. But I think it was like the juxtaposition of what I was seeing and how I would respond as a human. I know I just didn't never feel the sort of the closeness of all of this when I was in London. And
yeah, I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Being able to empathize. And when we are in our own isolation, we can only empathize when we're in relationship with the other. You know, that's when, yeah. So yeah, that's one thing that the pandemic did teach us. It taught us the importance of empathy, the importance of these connections. But thank you very much, Kath. That's been a wonderful conversation, and I've really found it inspiring speaking with you again. So